Borders drawn on maps often appear inert, like faint lines etched into parchment, yet they carry within them the pulse of authority, its insistence, its misjudgments, its continuing assertion. It is tempting to view the legacies of colonial cartography as historical accidents, mistakes of distant administrators who never saw the terrain they divided. But to assume randomness is to misunderstand the nature of power itself. Authority does not forget its own hand. It only conceals it beneath the illusion of permanence. The violence that flickers along these boundaries, decades or centuries after the imperial hand has supposedly receded, is not a series of unfortunate events. It is an echo of calculated imposition, a living trace of rulers who believed in the neatness of lines more than the complexity of the lands they claim to govern. The contradiction is stark. Borders are both artificial and enduring, fragile and coercive. They exist because authority insists, and their endurance is testimony not to order, but to the stubbornness of imposed control. The literal terrain of colonial borders is, in almost every instance, a record of calculation rather than geography. Consider the arbitrary straight lines of the Sahel slicing through pastoral lands without regard for migration, kinship, or river systems, or the dense jungles of Central Africa, bisected by meridians derived from European telescopes rather than local settlements. In South Asia, treaties drawn over cups of tea in distant halls transferred vast swaths of territory between administrations, ignoring the complexity of linguistic and religious demography. Authority never claimed to understand fully what it divided, and yet it demanded obedience from those who lived there. Colonial maps became instruments of power precisely because they created a visible structure for invisible control. Every line represented not a neutral boundary but a projection of legitimacy, a claim to govern lives and lands under a rubric that only rulers fully recognized. The unfolding pattern is relentless in its quiet assertion. Across decades, elites and administrators interpreted compliance as consent and coercion as acquiescence. Colonial powers believed that once a border was inscribed, it would carry authority indefinitely, as if ink could summon allegiance. Yet the borders themselves began to erode under the weight of local realities. Indigenous leaders navigated imposed systems, negotiating survival while subtly undermining central authority. Taxation records, censuses, and military deployments, intended as instruments of clarity, instead exposed gaps in understanding. The contradictions multiplied. Armies stationed to enforce order often discovered that loyalty was circumstantial. Civil administrations found that legal codes applied with universal intent produced selective obedience. Power, in its overconfidence, assumed that lines on a map were sufficient instruments of legitimacy. They were not. Even after independence, the logic of authority remained intact, quietly transmitted through newly formed states. Former colonial borders were sanctified by international law, yet they inherited the violence of their origin. Elites, trained under imperial bureaucracies, continued the practice of asserting territorial claims through legislation, policing, and military presence. The very fact that disputes erupt along these lines is an indicator of unresolved authority, not its absence. In parts of West Africa, disputes between communities over grazing rights or local resources trace directly to colonial administrative boundaries. In South Asia, partition lines drawn by hurried commissions left millions displaced, and the resulting conflicts are still managed by the shadow of state power. Authority persists because those who wield it continue to believe in the structures they inherited, even when those structures have never fully commanded consent. Legitimacy itself becomes a battleground. States act as if their borders are natural, when in fact, they are ongoing exercises in coercion. Military and bureaucratic structures repeat the patterns of colonial overreach, maintaining the impression of control through ritualized assertion. Yet within those rituals, cracks appear. Smuggling routes bypass official crossings, Informal economies thrive beyond surveillance, and local governance networks operate parallel to the state. The line between compliance and resistance blurs, yet the authority that imposed the borders interprets every fissure as a temporary lapse, not a structural flaw. The overconfidence of rulers lies in the assumption that their continued presence, their formal declarations, and their ceremonial insistence will stabilize a reality that was never stable to begin with. The endurance of borders is less an achievement than a symptom of authority's refusal to acknowledge its limits. Internal contradictions are starkest when violence is measured. State power, inherited from colonial governance, often manifests in localized coercion, checkpoints, military patrols, administrative oversight. Yet violence is not simply a tool, it is a signal, a performance of legitimacy. When armed conflict erupts along borders, it is frequently framed as a breach of sovereignty, an external threat to stability. But in truth, it is the legacy of authority struggling against the erosion of its own control. Political leaders rarely question the inherited logic of demarcation. They manage it, enforce it, and ritualize it. The border remains, and with it, the belief that control is possible. Each violent incident is a reminder that authority's confidence is itself fragile, even as it refuses to appear so. The fracture of perception is subtle but persistent. Authority maintains the semblance of control, even when local realities have diverged from imposed structures. Bureaucracies reproduce lines drawn a century prior. Military units patrol areas where allegiance is conditional, and courts adjudicate disputes as if sovereignty were self-evident. Inhabitants, aware of the artificiality of these divisions, adapt in ways that undermine the totality of state authority without appearing to confront it openly. Yet the governing elite interprets every act of adjustment as confirmation that the border works, that obedience can be maintained through ritual, discipline, and the threat of force. The fracture is internalized. Legitimacy has never fully extended to the populations governed, yet rulers continue to act as though it has. The tension is invisible to many, but it is constant, a pressure that authority cannot fully release. The reflective echo of these patterns is quiet, almost imperceptible. Maps remain on walls, treaties remain in archives, and the language of borders continues to dominate political discourse. Yet beneath the surface, authority operates in a delicate suspension. It believes it controls, while control is always partial. Violence continues to flare, and compliance continues to coexist with quiet circumvention. Authority remains convinced that coherence can be restored, that legitimacy can be asserted, that obedience can be commanded. The lines endure, but not because they are stable. They endure because power insists, and insists without admitting that its hold has never been absolute. Each act of governance, each patrol, each official declaration is both assertion and anxiety, a ritual meant to reconcile the impossibility of complete control with the necessity of projecting it. The border, in essence, is both a sign of power and a testament to its continuing tension. Authority is, therefore, less a structure than a performance. The enduring violence along colonial borders is not an aberration, but an expected consequence of the way rulers understand themselves. And they inherit a system built on imposition, trust its rituals, and interpret compliance as evidence of legitimacy. Yet every local deviation, every dispute, every act of resistance subtly erodes that confidence. The contradiction is never resolved. Power believes in the permanence of its lines, even while the lines are animated by the life of those over whom it claims sovereignty. In this tension, the borders endure, not as neutral markers, not as settled agreements, but as living instruments of authority that continue to demand obedience, belief, and vigilance. The violence that persists along these lines is neither historical accident nor inevitable chaos. It is the persistent echo of power under pressure, a pressure that refuses to relax even when the world beyond the map has changed irrevocably. Authority projects, insists, and polices. It interprets every act of adaptation as temporary. It believes that legitimacy can be performed into existence, and that compliance can be coerced into permanence. The borders, drawn under distant hands, remain enduring because those who govern them continue to act as though their lines must hold, that their declarations must be obeyed, and that their authority, like the maps they inherited, can define reality itself. Violence, disruption, and negotiation all coexist under this shadow. But the underlying certainty persists. Power, in its overconfidence, interprets endurance as evidence of its own correctness, even when endurance is measured in tension rather than consent. It is this belief, unshaken by contradiction, that keeps the colonial imprint alive, quietly compelling obedience, subtly conditioning expectation, and sustaining a geography of authority that has never been fully legitimate, but continues to operate as though it were. Subscribe to Timeless Questions for more thoughtful journeys into the ideas and forces that shape civilizations and continue to shape us.